Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our panel discussion, Are Whistleblowers Going to Save Us from the Arms of Tech? So my name is Delphine Halgand-Mishra, and I'm the founding executive director of the Signals Network. We are an international nonprofit, and we support and protect journalist sources, whistleblowers who have shared public interest information with the press. So we protect the sources before, during, and after the publication of the media articles, sometimes years after the publication. And in our team, we have 2 US attorneys who really every day receive requests of support from journalist sources, and we are able to provide legal support, psychological support, also sometimes temporary safe house, and if the source decide to go public, we can provide advocacy support if they have to go testify at parliaments, all the kind of support you can imagine to make sure that the sources are protected, but also that their revelation have impact. And as you can imagine, we do receive a lot of requests. In 2024, we were receiving on average 3 new requests of support every week. And what do you think we received in these last few weeks? We are at, on average, 10 new requests every week for the last few weeks. And most of the people come from the tech sector, and the second sector is the healthcare sector. So, but enough talking about me. We are here to talk about the whistleblowers and tech. And so I think I wanted to start very briefly before going to our panelists by setting a few elements I wanted to have in mind for this discussion. In these overwhelming times, I think it is important to remember all the benefits and opportunities that tech and AI development offer to all of us, even with a bit of AI hype. But it is also important to remember that these past years, all we know that went wrong in the tech or in AI, I think we know it thanks to the employees who spoke up, thanks to the whistleblowers from, if you think of Theranos, Facebook, Uber, Google, or OpenAI, we know what went wrong thanks to employees who spoke up, thanks to sources. And in these uncertain times, there's one thing that I'm really sure and certain about, is that it will continue to be the case. That we will continue to know what is going wrong in companies, in the government, thanks to insiders. So I'm happy to have with us a Facebook whistleblower, Sophie Zhang, and also Billy Perrigo, a Time correspondent. Very sadly, Tyler Schultz was supposed to be with us, but he had a family emergency and could not travel to Austin. And I'm really thinking of him and his family today, and I think we all wish he could be here with us. As you know, Tyler has been one of the main whistleblowers who worked with Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou on the reporting that really shed light on what was going wrong at the test blooding company Theranos. Tyler was 22 years old when he blew the whistle, and 10 years later, the charismatic founder of Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, is in jail now. I would invite all of you to listen to the audiobook that Tyler has done. It's an audiobook on Audible, and it's an amazing, really, audiobook to hear from his own voice, his whistleblowing journey. So as a small compensation, I invite you to listen to his audiobook to hear what he has to say about his journey. But let's turn to our panelists today who have a lot of things to say on the topic of the day. So Sophie, first, I want to turn to you. So you were a data scientist at Facebook. And in 2020, you shared documents with the press and later testified at different parliaments regarding Facebook reported roles in enabling worldwide political manipulation. So, the title of this session is Are Whistleblowers Going to Save Us from the Arms of Tech? So, with your experience, what do you think?
Thanks, everyone. So, and thanks, Delphine. So, I think that it's over-optimistic to count on whistleblowers to save us, as you put it, from tech or artificial intelligence or etc. First of all, whistleblowers can't do anything in isolation. All we can do is speak up, make our views heard and known, and there's no guarantee that any follow-through actually happens. That is up for the people and through them legislators and governments to determine. In my case, for instance, I came forward, but I'm not aware of any specific regulatory or legislative changes, tangible changes that have happened to address the issues that I brought forward.
But did Facebook change some policies just before your revelation made public?
I think Facebook has changed one policy due to me going public. That change is that Facebook has tightened down on its information control and against employee activism. So that's certainly a change, but it's not one I would consider to be conducive to fixing the problem at hand. Well, I'm sure Facebook sees the problem in a much different way than I do. And so that's the first part of what my response to this. The second part is that I feel like in an ideal world, whistleblowers would not exist. Whistleblowers only exist when there's a serious failure, when something has gone very wrong, not only within companies or organizations, but also in terms of oversight, so that it's impossible for anyone to figure out the situation without the assistance of the whistleblower. And certainly the world is imperfect, and so the whistleblower may be needed sometime, but to count on people to torch their careers and their life for the sake of a principle, it's not the most reliable of guarantees. I would also say that in terms of tech companies in general, there seems to be a mood shift since the last 4 or 5 years, in the sense that for a variety of reasons, including layoffs at tech companies and the tech company labor market slackening, as well as mood shifts within companies, and corporations are generally much less tolerant of employee activism, for lack of a better word, and employees speaking out. And so, for instance, when I came forward as a whistleblower, I was not worried about Facebook suing me for every penny, although they could certainly have done that, because I was defended by the fear of public response, by the fact that, frankly, a lot of the employees at Facebook would have sided with me in that case, and similar situations. But with the turn in the corporate tech world in the last 4 or 5 years, it would not surprise me if Facebook sued a whistleblower in the next few years. And so that is something that whistleblowers also need to consider now, that is a considerably greater risk than it was when I came forward.
Well, thank you for these very thoughtful points, and thank you for what you've done. So, Billy, you are working with sources from the tech sector, whistleblowers every day. You are a tech investigative reporter at Time Magazine. And last month, you wrote a piece that was called Don't Look Up, where you describe how AI capabilities have accelerated and how new AI models can attempt to even deceive their creators, and how governments starting with the French government, seem to give up setting red lines. And so I want to ask you the same question. So in this environment, will the whistleblower be the one saving us from the arms of tech?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thank you for having me here. The point I was trying to make in that piece was that governments seem to have essentially given up on setting global, at least, regulations around AI. And I think regulations are important for all kinds of reasons. But in this case, whistleblowers that we've seen in the past, some of them at least, have been protected in making their disclosures by regulations in certain fields. But those regulations, I'm thinking in the case of Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen, who came public in 2021, her whistleblower revelations were essentially protected under the SEC's program for whistleblower disclosures, which says if you can bring evidence that a company is defrauding its investors, you can receive essentially legal protection for example, breaking an NDA, which means that she basically had a route to kind of lawfully disclosing the things that she wanted to disclose, which in that case were Facebook knowing more about the harms of its platform than it let on in public. Those SEC laws weren't designed to allow for public interest disclosures about the harms to democracy of social media, but she used that pathway because it was one that was available to her. In the case of AI companies, there's not really a clear path to say these companies are defrauding their investors if a whistleblower wanted to come forward with worries about an AI displaying dangerous capabilities or being trained on biased training data or copyright infringement. I think there is actually probably a copyright infringement defense somewhere, but point being, we in the US and most jurisdictions around the world lack AI regulation in any form, but specifically one that would allow for whistleblower disclosures to be protected under law, which means that whistleblowers don't have essentially a legal recourse to share information with the press or regulators, which further from that means that if whistleblowers do make the personal momentous decision to share that information, they subject themselves to massive legal risk, to the risk of losing their careers, losing their reputations, being sued for all that they're worth, which is a lot in their case. And so what that means is there's all these kinds of structural factors that make whistleblowing more difficult. Will they save us from the harms of tech? Probably not. I agree with Sophie that every whistleblower is a kind of symptom of a broken system. But I would caution that the term whistleblower is actually it has a lot of baggage. When you think whistleblower, you think somebody who's come out in public to kind of crusade against a company that they used to work for. I think those are quite rare cases in the overall spectrum of the kinds of disclosure of public interest information. Most of the so-called whistleblowers who I work with don't go public. They want to remain anonymous. They want to keep their jobs. They want to continue to be in positions where they can, exert positive influence on the company that they're working in or the organization that they're working in. And so they, might disclose a piece of information to the press so that the public knows about something, but they don't want to torch their lives and careers by doing so. And I think it's important, and I'm glad that we have tools available to us to allow for the secure communications between journalists and sources like that. But what I'm worried about is increasingly we seem to be in a political and regulatory environment where it's kind of seen as okay to go after both sources and journalists. And so, yeah, I can't say I'm optimistic about the direction that we're heading in, but I do agree with Sophie that, to have that last resort available is a useful pressure valve. And I wish it was easier for the people who have been put in that position.
Now, you touch on many points. It is totally true that most of journalist sources or even whistleblowers remain anonymous. The public figures like Sophie, Frances Haugen, Tyler Schultz, Mark Magan, and so they are the rare example, the visible part of the iceberg. But really, and in our work, and when I say that last year in 2024, we provided active support to like 45 whistleblowers, maybe only 3 were big public figures. So I just wanted to highlight that. And on the other point that both of you touched, I think it's important to go a little bit deeper on that, on the difference between the people who fit the legal status of whistleblower, the legal protection status of whistleblower, so the people who are exposing illegal activities that I think will continue to apply for AI whistleblower, the SEC protection, the different whistleblower reward program in the US apply for AI whistleblowers. But there is a difference with the whistleblowers who are revealing unethical activities, which are not called illegal because there are no regulation on it. And that was the case for Sophie. You revealed unethical activities on topics that were not regulated. And we know that it will be the case with AI whistleblowers because they're revealing potential wrongdoing that are not covered by any kind of regulation. And that was, I think, a call that was made by OpenAI whistleblowers in June, the right to warn, really this thinking that employees of AI companies should have process they could go to when they see something wrong, when they have concerns about the development of AI, and this process do not exist. And I just want to hear your thoughts on this difference between the legal protection of whistleblower who reveal illegal activity and what we will probably see more and more, the whistleblowers will reveal unethical activity which are not regulated yet.
Yeah, thanks, Delphine. So just to summarize, there's both a legal and a colloquial definition of whistleblower. The first is protected under law. I fall under the second category, which is someone who reveals unethical behavior, but one that isn't directly illegal. In some cases, I have given documentation to law enforcement regarding illegal activity, but that was not the vast majority of what I did, most of which is not protected. And so, because as she said, in my case, there were no laws against it because it was a fundamentally new area. And I think this is something we'll see much more of going forward, especially in the artificial intelligence industry, though that's not something I directly worked on. One thing I would additionally add is that for people who don't have law protections, because in some cases of the close relationship with government and tech companies, whistleblowers face an additional risk that was not previously present, in that, in theory, the government, if it were willing and interested, could prosecute a number of whistleblowers for violating trade secret law. And that's something I was not worried at all when I came forward because of the political environment and the fact that at the time the government did not have a direct interest in doing Facebook's work for them, so to speak. But I think it's something that is going to be at risk going forward, especially as there seems to be an arms race in artificial intelligence, and the government could easily argue that, for instance, maybe the whistleblower exposed wrongdoing, but they're also giving away trade secrets to China or Russia or etc.
I think there's a useful question that Sophie's answer lets us ask, which is, okay, for the whistleblowers who aren't legally protected and yet still do disclose information, what is protecting them, or what has in the past protected them from retaliation? And I think often the answer to that is the Streisand effect, which is companies don't want to be seen to be going after people who disclose negative information about them, because in doing so, you essentially create a new news story, which is company comes after whistleblower, thus making the whistleblower's disclosures much more potent in the press. Yeah. The thing with that is it relies upon the wider culture seeing the whistleblower as in the right and the company as in the wrong. And I kind of get the sense that we might be moving more towards a media and political environment where tech companies coming after people who break the rules, people, these notoriously liberal tech employees who are kind of bringing their politics to work and all of that, those narratives. There seems to be a shift towards that not being seen as kind of normatively correct in the same way that it used to be seen in the last kind of decade of American public life. And so there is a kind of potentially growing risk, I might say, that a company might decide that the calculus has flipped, and in fact, it is now worth going after a whistleblower to make an example of them. I don't think we've really seen anything like that happen in the last 5 or 10 years. I could be wrong. But it seems like a lot has changed just in the last kind of few months. So I think the risk has certainly grown that might happen.
So I think we pointed of what we have seen shifting or what we are afraid of seeing coming. I would still come back to your experience, Sophie, because I think there's a lot that potential whistleblowers should learn from people who have been that way. And so I would like you to tell us what would you like potential whistleblowers to know if they're considering speaking up. What are the advice you give? And actually, Sophie wrote a whole op-ed in The Guardian listing these advice, so I invite you to read it. But please give us some of the thoughts you learned during the journey.
So I have actually had a number of people come to me privately for advice. So this isn't just me blowing smoke, like this is a concrete thing that I have done. So the first thing I always tell people is essentially know yourself, know what you're willing to risk. It depends a lot on what you're revealing. If you're revealing something that everyone in the company knows and has access to, you can probably get that to a reporter safely and not risk losing their job, because if it's the sort of thing that everyone in the company knows and has access to. But a large number of the times that's not the case. For instance, in my own case, I came forward regarding things that I was essentially the only expert and the only person who had shared interest in all the parts that I worked in. So as soon as I came forward, it was going to be incredibly obvious to anyone within the company who I was. And so at that point, the only question of anonymity was, do I care about the wider world knowing who I am? And I decided that I'm an introvert. I would much prefer not to be on stage. Like, this is my worst nightmare. But that said, I believe also in public accountability. And so I decided that the latter outweighed the former. But for most people, that is not the case, and that's a perfectly valid decision to make. I think it's easy for people to judge from the outside, to say essentially there should be more people coming forward, but it's not easy to voluntarily torch your life and career for the sake of a principle. Like it requires a certain level of insanity, essentially. And so essentially the first thing I would say to every person is, you should decide, what are you willing to risk? Are you willing to risk your career? Are you willing to perhaps not just this career, but like, for instance, with me, if I had kept my name out of it, that would probably have helped with future career prospects in the sense of getting another job in the tech world. I decided that I was less interested in that, and so I was willing to sacrifice that. But again, that's not a calculus that everyone should be willing to make. For some people at tech companies, they're on H1B,
Yes.
HB1, whatever.
H1B visa.
H1B visas, so their employment is tied to their visa status, and that makes it a much more difficult decision for them. Other people may, for instance, be in tougher financial straits for a variety of reasons. I had plenty of savings, and I'm a cheapskate, so that was not a huge consideration for me. So essentially, there are a number of things that you have to decide. That you have to consider and decide on first, because if you end up not thinking things through and end up essentially with your life messed up to an extent that you're not happy with because of the whistleblowing, obviously that affects you, and that's not something that I want to see happen to any whistleblower. But it also has a training effect on other whistleblowers to see that happen essentially. So essentially, my advice boils down to know yourself, know what you're willing to risk, and use that as your starting principle.
And then you have many more advice, like do not use your work device to contact a journalist. Do not take screenshots. Use your personal phone to take picture of the screen. If you are going public, use delete me to protect any information that could be found about you online. Lawyer up, I should have started with that.
Oh, yes.
Get lawyers, talk to lawyers to understand the risk, to understand the safe avenues, so then you can make informed decision. Basically, if you see something wrong and you want it to stop, you need to know what are the ways. And the question that I always ask whistleblowers who come to us, it's 3 questions that I ask them all the time is, what do you want to achieve? And once you see what you want to achieve, then we can inform you of all the ways to achieve it, and then depending on your own level of risk, you decide what you want to do. And nobody will blame you if you don't do it. If you need the healthcare for your children, that's completely understandable. So first question, what do you want to achieve? And see it, and then talking to regulators, talking to the press are ways to achieve it. Second is, what are the support network you have already around you? Do you have a lawyer? What kind of lawyer do you need? Do you have a therapist? Is your family supporting you? How much savings do you have? Did you apply for a new job? Because even if the company do not find out who you are, the stress of the internal investigation might be a lot. And the third question is, how do you see yourself after this whistleblowing period? Because it will be intense, but it's not the end of your life. You need to see what's coming up. And I like to ask people to think about that even before they take any decision, to project themselves in their after whistleblowing. But sorry. And you, Billy, so I need to say that I know Billy because he contacted me years ago when he was working on an investigation about the working condition of Facebook moderators in Kenya, employed by the company Sama. And he came to the Signals network because he considered that some of his sources needed some support, so we provided some legal support to the whistleblowers before the publication so they could know what were their legal risks. And then after the publication, we provided more legal but also psychological support, because some of the sources which were Facebook content moderator in Kenya were suffering from severe PTSD due to their work of content moderation. And then we also introduced the main whistleblower, Daniel Motog, to an NGO who helped him to sue Facebook and Sama for the way he was treated there, and so on and so on. So we know each other because we have worked and supported whistleblowers and sources together. So I want to come to you as a journalist who care for their sources and who care of keeping the ethics of journalists and in the right place. What's your vision of? Do you think that the sources today are more knowledgeable than a few years ago about the risks, or do you still feel that they still need to learn a lot about how to protect themselves? Have you seen a shift in the knowledge of the sources?
I think that's really hard to say because, as with every single whistleblower is different. Everyone has a different case. Everybody comes to it from a different place. To talk a little bit about the Facebook Africa story that we worked together on, I think that was interesting because it was a very clear example of how, in the media industry, the incentives of a journalist don't always point in the same direction as the incentives of a source. And that's why you often, well, not often, but sometimes hear about sources who are unhappy with how they've been portrayed in the media and feel burned and stuff like that. And I think most journalists do their jobs because they believe that it's a useful function in a democracy to have this method of public accountability. And while there are incentives at the individual level to, get good stories and impress your editors and all of this kinds of stuff, few people want to actively burn sources. But at the same time, structurally, I can't say to my source, I think you shouldn't do this story, or I think you need a lawyer who might advise you not to work with me anymore. Those kinds of things are really difficult, even though they might be in the interests of that source. And so I think it's no surprise that most journalists are naturally skeptical of bringing in a group like the Signals Network. I think in that specific case, it was so profoundly obvious to me that Daniel, this former Facebook content moderator, who had been fired from his job for attempting to start a union and had been having to watch essentially videos of murders and all the worst of humanity day in, day out for years. He was suffering from profound PTSD. He was living in poverty. He really had very few options available to him. And so I felt, I can't knowingly just run this interview and not have him know the consequences of his decisions, because it's a profoundly significant life decision to be making. And that's why, it was very clear. He was undiagnosed at the time, but it was very clear from talking to him that he had something that looked a lot like PTSD. So I introduced him with Delphine and said, look, I think it's very commendable of you that you want to go public with this, but I think you should try and understand exactly what you're getting in for so that you're making an informed choice. And I was lucky in that he'd had those conversations and said, yes, I still want to do this. And Delphine and the Signals Network were very kind in providing him with a therapist who persisted long after publication of that story. I think it's an atypical case for so many reasons, but I think it shows that in an ideal world, journalists would look out for the best interests of their sources, but that's not always the case, and you kind of have to swim against the grain a little bit if you want that to happen, and it can look very different depending on the circumstances of the story. But I guess my advice to whistleblowers would probably be try and pick your journalist by reading what they've written in the past, by kind of try to understand what approach they take in their framings of stories, because you want to make sure that it matches with your own, but also try and look at who they've worked with in the past and whether they had good experiences there. And I'm not saying that to blow my own horn or to Delphine's, but I think, to Sophie's point, making this decision is a really transformative moment in your life. And after you do that, if you do choose to do that, nothing will ever be the same for you. And so it's important to make an informed decision. And you can't always trust that a journalist will have your best interests at heart, even if some of them will.
But Sophie, what are the advice you give to people about working with journalists? Because you've learned a lot also working with journalists. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so just continuing with Billy's point, I think, I mean, my experience isn't universal, but looking just at myself, when I came forward as a whistleblower, basically I was in a state of extreme personal vulnerability, because in my own case, the issue that I whistleblew about had essentially expanded to the point where it had taken over most of my life. I had become socially isolated from most of my connections and support network because I couldn't talk to them about it. I was very used to being ignored, argued against, and dismissed. And I was entering a new space that was both terrifying and that I knew absolutely nothing about. And so basically in that situation, I think a whistleblower is extremely vulnerable and often looking for someone that they can trust and rely on. And I really appreciate that you referred to the Kenyan whistleblower to the Signals Network, for instance, because that's not something I had access to when I came. Well, I mean, in theory, I had access to it, but it did not occur to me, and I don't think it was suggested to me when I became a whistleblower. I was very concerned when I came forward as a whistleblower about, for instance, a reporter breaking their source agreement and turning the story into something that I didn't want. One of the things that had came up around that time was that it was that it was reported that the Pentagon Papers was in fact published by the reporter who essentially stole the documents from his source without asking permission, and that was something I was terrified would happen to me, and in retrospect, I should have been less concerned about the reporter essentially breaking the terms of our agreements, and more worried just about the natural conflict of interest, as Billy put it, because ultimately, like, a reporter does have different interests from the source, and that's all right, but it needs to be remembered. Yep. So essentially, the main thing I wished that I knew before coming forward was get an organization like the Signals Network to help me.
And to be honest, I don't know if you remember, Sophie, but just after you became public, I was living in Berkeley, and I reached out to you, and we met, but you were very worried to trust anyone.
I was terrified of trusting everyone. I was extremely distrustful, and frankly, I was too. I honestly don't remember that meeting. I completely forgot. But I think a lot of tech people coming forward are worried about things like, if I talk to a journalist off the record, will they keep that off the record? If I give journalists documentations with stipulations of you can't publish these documents, will they agree to that? And I was one of those people, frankly. But since then, my experience at least in the Western reporting industry is that reporters at mainstream Western publications are usually trustworthy. And so essentially, I think I was worried about the wrong things at the time.
But I do think it's very important for the people who reach out to the media to know what to negotiate with the journalist, to be very clear of this is off the record, getting the journalist to confirm, yes, this is off the record, which means I cannot use anything of what you say, even on background. So what does it mean on background? What is on the record? So it's important for people to really know what they can negotiate, that they can also control the timeline. Sorry, Billy, that's when I'm pushing the sources to be like, you can tell the journalist that they can only use this at that date, or when you give them the green light, once you have a new job, or once the lawyers have said it's okay. And so we spend a lot of time telling the sources that you have the information, you can control how people use it.
I probably would say this because I'm a magazine journalist, but there are very different time pressures if you're talking with a newspaper versus talking with a magazine. And those longer lead times tend to lend themselves to longer form journalism that, instead of focusing on just the daily news value of a given disclosure, can kind of take a step back, set everything in context, make sure it happens at the right time. But yeah, I disclose my own conflict of interest in saying that.
I might come to another question that comes often is people ask, do you think all the whistleblowers, all the sources have something in common? And I can never really point out to something. I'm like thinking, but none of the whistleblowers I talk to have a dull character, but there's no real, I think everybody can be a whistleblower. It's not like you're a hero, but I just wanted to come back to something you said in a previous panel, Sophie, and that stayed with me because I found it very profound, and maybe it's something that other whistleblowers can recognize. You said something like, when you were young, you were failed by others, and you told yourself that if one day you were in a position of responsibility, you would do your best to not fail others. And I think that's an amazing way of thinking and acting. And I just want to go back to that, and if you think that's common to your decision or to others' whistleblowers' decision.
I think it's a very personal decision for everyone, and I certainly would not want to project my own experience on others. Like for me, I had very specific motivations. Like, it's in the public record that I was abused as a child and was not helped by authority figures. Like, when I was in graduate school, I was studying a PhD program in physics at Princeton, and I was sexually harassed. And frankly, I was silly at the time. I should have gotten evidence, but I didn't, and so it turned into a he said, she said, and so, I mean, you can probably guess now why I was so intent and obsessive about documenting everything that I gave to The Guardian. But anyways, in my case, the point I took from these experiences was that essentially I saw myself as being failed by society, by authority figures repeatedly, and because, I mean, in each case there were extenuating factors, but still it was my lived life at the end that was the outcome. And I told myself when I was young and silly that if I'm ever in a position of authority, I'll do my best to make sure that I don't fail everyone. And I was young and silly. I never knew how big it was going to get. And especially because that's not a lot of responsibility. Like, if you're making difficult decisions, you are probably going to end up failing at some point. And so that was basically an impossible standard to hold myself to. But I tried anyways. But again, that's my own experience. Like, I think everyone is different. I certainly wouldn't presume to speak on their behalf. People come forward for different reasons. Some are motivated by doing the right thing. Some are motivated by fame. Some are motivated by specific ideals. I certainly wouldn't want to make assumptions or presumptions about the reasons for doing so.
Well, thank you. Well, I think we will open the floor for questions. So please, if you could introduce yourself quickly and come up to the mic to ask a short question, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
My name is Juan. The request for comment is adjudication versus regulation. The issue is privacy. In the original adjudicated case of privacy, the right to privacy when somebody closed the phone booth was the key factor in generating laws that governed wiretapping conversations and stuff like that. We have lost that protection because of regulation. Now, if you talk on the phone, you're more likely that you're being trapped from because of the regulations that, you know, if you agree to the terms of use, you give up the right to speech and you just kind of disclose it to a second party and it's no longer private. Okay? We seem to have done a paradigm shift from adjudication an issue like privacy in the first case versus regulation of privacy versus the regulations that we have now that basically give us no privacy.
I don't think
Can you comment on that?
Those aren't regulations, though, that you're talking about. Those are terms of use for a
But they come back to regulation.
Well,
the terms of use were imposed because of regulations on the phone companies. You know, that's the area.
there are privacy-preserving technologies like Signal if you want to have private conversations, and I think we would probably all recommend that if you're a whistleblower trying to get in touch with a journalist, or indeed just trying to have private conversations as a private citizen, you'd be well advised to use
face-to-face.
Signal.
Encrypted messenger.
Yes, I preferentially use Signal for my communications.
And there's a keynote by the Signal president just after this session that I think we will all go to, because that will be very enlightened on this point. But please, thank you.
Sure. Hi. I have one question for each of you. Billy, there's a lot of conversation, especially in the US, around Europe stifling innovation when it comes to AI because of what's being referred to as excessive regulation. I was just wondering on your thoughts around that. Are they just kind of throwing a tantrum, or is there really, too much regulation? And then Sophie, I'm in the children's online safety space, so I just want to say thank you for what you did. As a fellow introvert, I can't even imagine how you did what you did. But I was wondering, I often have conversations about our online spaces, social media in particular. Are they safe for children? And I was just wondering how you would answer that question, kind of having been on the inside. It's not a simple one, it's probably not a yes or no, but just kind of your thoughts around that. Thank you both.
So I just want to be clear that I did not work on anything associated with social media and children. That's absolutely not my area of expertise. I know Frances has testified to the US Congress regarding some aspects of that question, and I think she's probably better credentialed in terms of having access to user studies and similar to answer that question than me. I do think that most social media companies at least have official restrictions against children or people under certain ages using them. But I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer just because this is, I don't want to speculate wildly on things that are outside my area of expertise that I don't have any more than a layperson understanding of, and this is unfortunately one of them.
I think there's a lot of reasons that Silicon Valley is located in California and not Europe. And while regulations are one piece of that, there are lots of others that make it a much more complicated picture. Risk-taking culture, developed venture capital ecosystem, being in a industrialized superpower. I think it's a very useful argument that you often hear from people who want less regulation in the US, that the reason there aren't billion-dollar tech companies, many in Europe, is due to more stringent regulations in Europe. I would be skeptical of those people because they have a vested interest in removing what few regulations there actually are in America. So yeah, I think there's maybe a little bit of truth to it, but I'm not confident that it's the whole picture.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, Inkari from Estonia. I'm a user experience expert. Hearing your conversation, it made me think about the Me Too movement. I see it as a wave of whistleblowing, and this creating maybe a bigger current or bigger impact in the society, and the people speaking up being a part of this wave, maybe being a little bit more protected. So one question is, how do you see this movement, or how would you reflect on it? Do we see another one coming, maybe on a different topic? Have you noticed other movements, maybe similarly? And also the conversation got me thinking about the blockbuster movie Conclave, which is about electing the new pope. I think we see some micro whistleblowing there as well, how you can follow your heart and take responsibility on how things are happening in your organization. Not sure if you've seen it or if any thoughts are sparking there as well, but yeah, those two kind of conversation starters.
Maybe I can start. So on the Me Too whistleblowers, we did provided protection and support to many Me Too whistleblowers who brought very important information to media about key figures who were abusing their position of powers in the US media. And so we provided legal support to many women. And it's still happening. It's still the case. Actually, even last week, we had again that what we call Me Too whistleblower, when it's really someone who come with revelation about systemic sexual harassment in a very famous company. So it's still happening, and definitely there's been a before and after, and they continue to need specific support. But on the second part of the question, I don't know if someone else.
I think it's an interesting question. It's always impossible to tell in the present moment what kind of results any movement that you're taking part in is going to have. It was a huge upswell of people telling their stories for the Me Too movement, but it also sparked a counter-reaction that we've seen in politics. And I think in the tech industry, there's maybe something comparable happening. For a long time, tech companies have been seen as employing very liberal workforces, people who weren't afraid to go against what their CEOs were saying, who and whistleblowing is a part of that, feeling emboldened and empowered to go to the media with concerns. And you can see it really triggered all of the tech CEOs. They absolutely hate it. And there's funny stories about Mark Zuckerberg saying in the all hands, like, please just stop leaking. And then immediately that gets leaked. But I think it's unfortunate because it does, and it has sparked a counter-reaction among the tech elite who, like Elon Musk is a great example, who've basically shifted from just doing business to doing politics because, among many other reasons, they want to crack down on what they see as like uppity workforces who don't follow their rules enough. So I don't think that's an argument for not being a whistleblower, and you can't predict the future. And obviously all of the disclosures that most of those whistleblowers have made is really positive for the world. But none of us can truly model the very complex system that we all live in. So it's a leap of faith all the time.
We'll take the next questions.
Hi, my name is Beck. A question for Sophie. I was just wondering, did you think about what your life might look like, 5-10 years down the track, and to what extent does your life today look the way that you pictured it might do after making the disclosure?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yes,
stand closer, sorry.
Yes.
Just wondering if you thought about what your life might look like, 5 years post making the disclosure, and how does your life match up today to what you thought it might look like after whistleblowing?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think I had a naive view of it in that I thought I would make the disclosures, I would have my 15 minutes of fame, so to speak, and then I would go back to my normal life and get a job and everything. So as you can see, that has not quite panned out the way that I intended. I would say that there's a number of factors behind that. I think part of that is that I was extremely burnt out by my time at Facebook, and because I'm an introvert, doing press appearances also continued to burn me out even further. And so essentially I needed a lot of time in that regard. I think part of it was also there's a number of factors. I did do interviews with some tech companies. Actually, Twitter tried to recruit me before Elon Musk bought it, and then changed their mind. And so perhaps that was a dodged bullet in any case. And also, I think I was also reluctant to get a job when I was having my 15 minutes of fame, because it would become such a media spectacle if I decided to work at any specific place. So there's a number of reasons. And anyways, I think I am going to start looking into a job going forward now that everything has died down, but obviously that has not quite transpired yet. Thank you.
But thank you for pointing that out, because most of the tech whistleblowers that I work with, they did receive offers for new jobs after they came public. And they did not take these offers for a number of reasons, because maybe they were not ready to move on, they were still wanted to focus on the revelation and their impact. But I think it's important to say that, because it's a big difference that I see between tech whistleblowers and whistleblowers from the financial or healthcare sectors. Tech whistleblowers, I'm not saying it's a bonus for your career, no, but they do receive offers for new jobs. If you're a whistleblower in the financial sector or bank, it might not be, it's not that often the case. So I just wanted to point that out. And that also reflects on, I think people do not realize that when you become a public whistleblower, then it becomes your job, full-time job, for years. People do not see that it's a full-time job to answer interview, to go talk to authorities, and so on and so on. Sorry, your question.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Fiona. I have a question for the three of you. What specific steps do you think we could take as a society to sort of systematically better protect whistleblowers? Do you think legal routes would be the better option? Obviously, politics could come into play there. Or do you think we should more focus on amplifying and multiplying companies like the Signal Network? What do you think would be most efficacious?
Thank you for your question, and I think we can use it as the final round. I think a combination of everything. We are definitely pushing to make sure that any new AI regulation include whistleblower protection. I think public awareness of the public being more caring for the whistleblowers, more aware of what they're going through, more resources for organizations like us so we are able to answer all the requests and support the people on the long term. So all of this, I also want to point out to some resources that exist. There's something called the Tech Worker Handbook that was led by Ifeoma Ozoma, which is a Pinterest whistleblower, and rewrote the legal section. It gives you really all the advice, and Sophie, you helped us too, all the advice on what tech workers should know if they're considering blowing the whistle. For journalists, I would like to refer to the AI chapter of the AP style book that was written by Garance Burke, who really inform and give guidance to journalists covering AI. And I will stop there and let Sophie and Billy give final words.
Yeah. So this is complete speculation, and I don't know how feasible it would be. But I feel like it might be helpful to have some government regulation that says employees at companies should be able to give the government privately information if they think it's of the public interest and have them be legally protected. Because something that struck me since I came forward has been essentially how little people inside government and legislators and their staff seem to know of social media companies like Facebook and what's going on inside it. Like things that I think are very basic that almost everyone inside the company knows were not public to them, and they had to ask what seemed to me like extremely basic questions. And I don't know if the regulation I just suggested is viable or even legal, but that's just an idea thrown out there.
Yeah, I think we need laws that specifically carve out legal methods of disclosing breaches of those laws. In the case of AI, that basically doesn't exist. And it means that anyone who is trying to disclose information about that has to put themselves at risk. And that doesn't mean that you just have to go straight to government and those disclosures remain private. There are routes to going public with information that you do disclose to the government legally, which is a model that we saw in the case of Frances Haugen. Slightly more self-interestedly, I would say the media industry right now is dying for all kinds of reasons. There's big limitations on the amount of money that is available to spend not only on reporting, but also on legal defense against lawsuits from people who believe that they've been libeled, from companies who a whistleblower might have disclosed information about. And so the media environment that we're living in is such that it becomes harder for media companies to defend themselves in a court of law against lawsuits like that, and I think that's dangerous at a systemic level for a whole lot of reasons. I think we need better ways of rewarding content creators online. I hate to call journalism content creation, but it's essentially, systemically, it is. We need better ways of having an equitable system for rewarding the people who bring value, instead of having the vast majority of the profits from ads flow to the big tech companies who, by the way, often are the people who the whistleblowers are complaining about. So the whole system is really fragile and is going in a kind of negative direction, in my opinion. And AI is only going to add another curveball to the mix. So it's really hard to know how that's going to turn out. But basically, if media companies have less money to hand, there are several knock-on effects that mean it makes it much harder for them to safely disclose public interest information.
Well, thank you, Billy. Thank you, Sophie. And thank you to all of you. And have a great time in Austin.